Richard Hale wasn't just a rich man, he was the rich man. The kind of person whose name you saw embossed in bronze on the side of new community centers and hospital wings. He was the CEO of Hale Global, a powerhouse investment firm. But his real commodity wasn't stocks or bonds, it was admiration.
He wasn't simply managing a corporation. He was managing a brand constructed on being remarkably virtuous. Every quarter, the executive committee gathering was conducted in the principal conference chamber, elevated in the Hale Tower with views across downtown Manhattan. It was invariably a spectacle. Glass partitions, burnished mahogany, and an environment dense with elevated anticipations. This Tuesday morning, the atmosphere was especially electric. Richard, flawlessly attired, occupied the head position of the extended table, the embodiment of prosperity and benevolence. The gathering was advancing precisely as intended. Following the arid financial statements, which everyone primarily scanned, relying on Richard to manage the complicated particulars, arrived the centerpiece, the quarterly Charitable Initiatives section. This was the segment where the committee got to experience satisfaction about themselves and, significantly, about Richard. Seated silently toward the rear, attempting earnestly to dissolve into the costly leather of her seat, was Emily Hale. She was Richard's 10-year-old daughter, present as a special visitor for Career Day. She was expected to be observing the importance of corporate existence, but she primarily felt like she was wearing a disguise. She gripped her tablet device beneath the table, wishing she could simply be back at her elementary school in the city. Even more distant in the back, virtually against the partition, was Mark Lewis. Mark was a junior compliance administrator. He was the variety of individual who understood precisely where every dollar was intended to be allocated, but nobody ever requested his perspective unless something had already become terribly incorrect. He was orderly, silent, and deeply underpaid. Mark was anxious about his rent, anxious about his student debts, and anxious, truthfully, about the employee compensation structure that had been mysteriously postponed for the previous 2 quarters. He was a component in the apparatus, and he understood it. The illumination dimmed. Now, before we transition into the Q3 risk evaluation, Richard proclaimed, his voice refined and magnified through the chamber's concealed speakers, I want us to take a moment to contemplate the influence of the Hale Global Commitment. The enormous screen, extending the breadth of the partition, blazed to existence. It was a professionally manufactured video, the variety that cost more than Mark Lewis earned in a year. Expansive, emotional orchestration swelled. The video concentrated on the recently finished affordable housing initiative in Newark, New Jersey. It displayed smiling families accepting keys, children playing in a new, pristine park, and volunteers in Hale Global vests painting partitions. Richard's voice narrated over the images, warm and comforting. We believe corporate prosperity is measured not merely by quarterly returns, but by the legacy we leave behind. Contributing back is not charity, it is a fundamental investment in the future of our society. The camera lingered on Richard, standing tall and noble, shaking hands with a woman who looked genuinely moved. He appeared like a saint. Susan Park, a senior committee member recognized for her absolute composure, nodded gradually. The remainder of the committee murmured approvingly. This wasn't merely a contribution, it was a performance designed to solidify Richard's position as the moral compass of the corporation. It maintained confidence. It made the shareholders rest peacefully at night. When the video concluded, the lights ascended, and there was a soft, appreciative wave of applause. It was the sound of wealth affirming virtue. Richard beamed, absorbing it in. Thank you, team. It's important we remember why we do what we do.
That's when Emily made her move. She felt a sudden, peculiar impulse to participate. She had been playing with her tablet earlier and had accidentally recorded something when she was visiting her dad's office last week. She'd been trying to make a silly video of herself making faces while waiting for him to finish a boring phone call. She thought maybe she had a funny clip of one of the workers dropping papers or something that would make everyone laugh. The system was still connected to the video feed console from the presentation. Emily, excited and not thinking clearly, quickly walked over with her small tablet, found what she thought was the right cable, and plugged it in. She tapped the screen with her small fingers, selecting what she believed was the funny video she'd recorded. Just something to make everyone smile before the boring stuff starts again, she thought innocently. But instead of any break room mishap, the screen instantly displayed a file designation, Daddy Office Recording.mp4. It was a shaky video, clearly filmed from a peculiar angle, maybe from where Emily had propped her tablet on a shelf to record herself being silly. The setting was Richard's enormous private office. It was from several days earlier. Richard was visible, standing over his desk, pointing emphatically at a large, complex spreadsheet spread out across the mahogany surface. The columns were highlighted in garish red and green, and the numbers were large enough to be clearly legible even from the back of the room. Across the desk sat Mr. Henderson, the firm's senior accountant, looking pale and nervous. The chamber, which had just been filled with low murmurs of self-congratulation, went absolutely silent. The audio, however, was painfully clear.
"Look, Henderson." Richard's voice boomed from the sound system, amplified far beyond conversational volume. He sounded impatient, his tone stripped of the public warmth he used just moments ago. "The Newark payment process is next week, $3 million. That's what we committed. It's non-negotiable for the media cycle. We require that photo opportunity and the positive coverage now." He slammed his finger down on the spreadsheet, right near a column labeled Q3 Bonus Pool. "We're short by $3 million to keep the quarterly earnings projection steady. We need that liquidity to appear favorable for the analysts next week. You understand the procedure." Henderson shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, the Q3 employee performance bonuses are scheduled to disperse next Friday. We've already transmitted preliminary notifications to department heads. Delaying them now—" Richard cut him off with a sharp wave of his hand. "Postpone them. Postpone them to Q1 next year. Inform HR it's a restructuring of incentive timing. Call it a strategic shift. I don't care what you call it. Just make the transfer. I need the goodwill from the Newark story now. Investor confidence depends on this image, Henderson. The bonuses can wait. They always wait." The camera lingered on the spreadsheet for a crucial extra second, showing the account codes and the exact dollar amount being moved. The atmosphere in the boardroom turned ice cold. Richard, who had been leaning back in his chair, a slight victorious smile still playing on his lips from the applause, simply froze. His face went slack, the color draining instantly.
Emily stood by the console, her small hand still hovering near the screen. She didn't realize what she had done until the phrase, "The bonuses can wait," echoed through the silent room. Her eyes widened in confusion and then horror. She hadn't meant to share that. She realized she must have accidentally selected the wrong file when her tablet had been recording while she sat in Daddy's office being quiet. Her small heart hammered against her ribs. She looked at her father, who was staring at the blank space where the image had been, his face looking scary and angry in a way she'd never seen before. It was Mark Lewis, the junior compliance officer, who felt the full physical blow of the reveal. His eyes were locked on the screen, even after the image disappeared. He didn't need the video to play more than 10 seconds. He recognized the account codes. He had seen that specific internal spreadsheet format countless times. That $3 million wasn't just an abstract accounting maneuver. It was his long-promised performance increase. It was the delayed security deposit he needed to move out of his cramped shared apartment. He was directly, personally affected by the decision that Richard had just so casually made to protect his public image. Mark was the weak mirror in the room, reflecting the true cost of Richard Hale's celebrated generosity. He sat perfectly still, a sickness crawling up his throat. Susan Park, the board member, didn't flinch. She watched the blank screen with the detached intensity of a surgeon observing a failed operation. Her focus wasn't on the morality, but on the catastrophic breach of security and the potential damage to their stock. Emily finally managed to yank the cable from the wall with both her small hands. The screen went dark, but the words, "The bonuses can wait," remained etched onto the collective memory of the room. The silence that followed wasn't merely the absence of sound. It was the heavy, suffocating weight of shared professional shame. If you're finding this story compelling, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. This narrative about corporate ethics and redemption is just getting started, and you won't want to miss what happens next. Richard didn't explode. He didn't try to explain. He just sat there, looking smaller than he had moments before. After what felt like an eternity, Richard cleared his throat. The sound was dry, rasping, utterly unlike the confident voice of the video narration. "Right," he managed, his voice barely above a whisper. He straightened his tie, a purely mechanical gesture. "Mr. Thompson, let's move to the risk assessment update, shall we? We have a lot to cover." The meeting resumed, but the energy was gone. The polished facade had cracked, showing the ugly, calculating mechanism underneath. No one applauded the rest of the presentations. No one offered a supportive comment. They simply listened, their eyes occasionally flicking towards Richard, who avoided all eye contact, focusing intently on the papers in front of him. The meeting dragged on for another hour, every minute feeling like an hour. When the meeting finally adjourned, the chairs scraped back slower than usual. People gathered their briefcases, their movements hesitant, their usual friendly chatter absent. They filed out of the room, one by one. And as they left, not a single person stopped to thank Richard Hale for his time, or for his vision, or for his generosity. They simply walked past the man who had just paid for an entire community center with their promised wages, leaving him alone at the head of the table in the sudden, echoing silence of the mahogany room. The silence that swallowed the Hale Global boardroom wasn't just deafening, it was sticky, like spilled honey, clinging to the expensive suits and the polished wood.
Richard Hale sat there long after the last board member, a man named Mr. Thompson, had closed the heavy glass door with agonizing slowness. Richard didn't move. He didn't check his phone. He didn't call his assistant. He just stared at the empty space where the projection screen had been, seeing the ghost of that spreadsheet, the red highlight on the Q3 bonus pool column, the visible, damning proof of his hypocrisy. He felt a physical ache in his chest, not of remorse, but of profound, total exposure. His carefully crafted fortress of benevolence had been breached, not by a hostile takeover or a market downturn, but by a 10-year-old girl with an accidentally connected tablet device. Emily finally walked back into the room. She had been standing outside in the hall, her small body trembling, leaning against the marble wall, waiting for the room to clear. She felt sick with confusion and guilt, a dizzying mix of not fully understanding what she had revealed, but knowing from everyone's faces that it was very, very bad. "Daddy," she whispered, taking a hesitant step toward the table, her voice small and frightened. Richard finally moved. He didn't look up, but his hand swept across the mahogany surface, knocking over his crystal water glass. It didn't break, but the water spread quickly, soaking the agenda notes. "Leave," he said, his voice flat, dangerously devoid of emotion. Emily stopped dead, her small frame freezing. "Daddy, I'm really sorry. I didn't mean to play that video. I promise. I thought I picked the silly one I made. It was an accident." Her voice trembled, tears already forming in her eyes. He lifted his head then, and the look in his eyes was something she had never seen before. It wasn't the disappointed daddy look when she forgot to do her homework, or the stern look when she talked back. It was the look of a man who had just seen his entire life's work disintegrate, and he was looking at his 10-year-old daughter, as if she were a stranger.
"An accident?" Richard spat the word out like a piece of spoiled meat. "You think exposing $3 million, destroying investor trust, and creating a potential investigation is an accident, Emily? Do you have any idea what you've done?" "I didn't know," she cried out, her small hands balling into fists at her sides. "I was just trying to show something funny. I didn't know that video was on there." Richard stood up, his chair scraping back harshly. He walked around the table until he was towering over her small frame. "You shouldn't have been playing with technology you don't understand. You shouldn't have been recording anything in my office. You're 10 years old, Emily. You're supposed to sit quietly and observe, not sabotage everything I've built." He wasn't angry about delaying the bonuses. He wasn't bothered by the actual impact on the employees. He was furious that the numbers were public, that the trade-off was visible. "But Daddy," Emily said, her voice cracking as tears rolled down her cheeks, "those people needed their money. The man on the video looked really scared. You said it could wait, but—" "It can wait," Richard roared, finally losing control. "You don't understand anything about business, Emily. You're a child. This isn't about being nice or mean. This is about keeping everything running, and you just threw a wrench into machinery you can't even begin to comprehend." Emily stepped back, now openly crying, her small shoulders shaking. But beneath the tears, something in her face showed she understood more than he thought. She understood that her daddy, the man everyone said was so good and kind, had just taken money from people who needed it, so he could look good in pictures. "I want to go home," she choked out between sobs, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. "I want Mommy."
"You can't go home yet," Richard said, his voice dropping back to that dangerous, controlled whisper that was somehow scarier than the yelling. "You're going to give me your tablet, and you're going to tell me exactly how you recorded that video, and if you showed it to anyone else. Did you show Mommy? Did you show your friends?" "No one," she insisted, clutching the tablet protectively against her chest like it was a stuffed animal. "I didn't even know I recorded it. I was just sitting in your office waiting for you to finish your call, and I was playing with my tablet, and I guess it was recording the whole time. I'm sorry, Daddy. I'm really, really sorry." She paused, a new realization dawning on her young face, making her look even more upset. "You didn't even know I was there. I was sitting right there on your couch for a whole hour, and you never even looked at me." Richard just stared at her, the calculating gears turning. He knew he couldn't afford to have this fight escalate. He needed damage control, and fast. And more importantly, he couldn't have his 10-year-old daughter talking about this at school, to her mother, to anyone. "Fine," he ground out, reaching down and pulling the tablet from her small hands before she could protest. "Go wait in my assistant's office. Mrs. Chen will call your mother to come pick you up early. And Emily." His voice became very serious and cold. "You are not to talk about what happened in that meeting to anyone. Not your mother, not your teacher, not your friends at school. Do you understand me? Not a single word." Emily nodded quickly, fresh tears streaming down her face, and fled the room, her small footsteps echoing in the hallway as she ran. Richard stood there, holding his daughter's tablet, left alone once more, the silence now heavier with the weight of their fractured relationship and the dawning realization that he had just threatened a frightened 10-year-old child into silence to protect his reputation. 2 floors below, Mark Lewis was staring at his desktop screen, but he wasn't seeing the compliance reports. He saw the spreadsheet. He saw the $3 million. He had walked out of the boardroom in a haze, navigating the plush hallways automatically, his mind working in frantic, cold clarity. He was usually invisible, which was fine, but now he had knowledge that made him anything but invisible. Mark was one of the people who had received the preliminary notification about the Q3 performance bonus. He had factored that money, about $4,000, a significant sum for him, into his budget for the next 6 months. He was going to pay off the highest interest portion of his student loan and finally put down that security deposit on the studio apartment near the river. Now he understood why the HR memo had suddenly changed last week, citing strategic timing adjustments. It wasn't strategic, it was theft, justified by Richard Hale's need for a better photo opportunity in Newark. Mark sat there, his hands resting on the cold keyboard. He was a compliance officer. His job was to ensure the firm followed the rules, but the firm's CEO had just explicitly broken a rule, or at least violated the spirit of good faith employment, and Mark had documentation of the exact accounts involved, thanks to that accidental video clip. He felt a terrible, crushing sense of powerlessness. What was he supposed to do? Go to HR? They reported to Richard. Go to the SEC? He would be fired before he finished the sentence, blacklisted from every major firm on the East Coast, and his student debt would sink him. But the knowledge was a physical weight. He knew that Richard Hale was a fraud, and that Mark Lewis was paying the price for the fraud's public image. A soft voice broke his concentration. "Mark, are you all right?" It was Sarah, another junior analyst. She had been in the meeting, sitting a few rows ahead of Mark. She looked pale too. "Yeah, Sarah, just a lot of numbers today," Mark mumbled, trying to sound normal. Sarah leaned closer, lowering her voice conspiratorially. Did you see the spreadsheet detail? I mean, I didn't get a good look, but those account codes." Mark met her eyes. He knew she was asking if he realized what it meant. "I saw them," he confirmed quietly. Sarah swallowed hard. "The Q3 bonuses, that's what he moved. My husband and I were counting on that for the IVF treatments." She didn't cry, but the look of desperate disappointment in her eyes hit Mark harder than any shouting.
It wasn't just his security deposit. It was IVF treatments. It was mortgages. It was the collective expectation of thousands of hard-working employees, sacrificed for a PR campaign. Mark realized he wasn't alone in recognizing the damage. Everyone in that room, from the junior staff to the board members, now knew the real cost of Richard Hale's generosity. And somewhere in the building, a 10-year-old girl was waiting to be picked up by her mother, having just learned that the father she admired wasn't the hero everyone pretended he was. Susan Park wasn't in her usual office. She was in the firm's secure communications bunker, a windowless room 3 floors below ground, designed for crisis management. She sat across a long table from Mr. Davies, the head of legal, and Miss Chen, the head of corporate communications. Susan hadn't needed to call Richard. She knew Richard would be busy dealing with the immediate emotional fallout and probably traumatizing his young daughter. Susan dealt with the strategic, lethal consequences.
"The clock is ticking," Susan stated, her voice sharp and clinical. She didn't waste time on pleasantries or shock. That video was visible for approximately 45 seconds. The audio was clear. We have 17 witnesses, most of whom are key investors or directors, who now know that Richard Hale utilized $3 million designated for employee performance bonuses to cover a public philanthropic pledge, specifically to ensure a favorable press cycle. Mr. Davies, a nervous man even on a good day, adjusted his glasses. "The primary exposure, Susan, is fiduciary duty violation and potential shareholder liability. If the stock takes a hit based on this reputational damage, the board will be obligated to act." "It will take a hit," Susan corrected him. "The narrative of Richard Hale is the backbone of our institutional confidence. If that narrative fails, the confidence fails. We have less than 12 hours until the Hong Kong market opens, and the European markets follow shortly after. We must control the narrative before the opening bell rings in New York tomorrow." Miss Chen, a communications specialist known for her icy demeanor, leaned forward. "We need a counter-narrative, and we need to address the source of the video." "The source is his 10-year-old daughter," Susan pointed out dryly, "a child who was playing with a tablet and accidentally triggered the playback. That complicates things legally and emotionally, but it actually simplifies the public relations angle. It was clearly an innocent technical mishap by a child who didn't understand the technology, which makes it impossible to claim malicious intent." "But what about the content?" Davies pressed. "The delay of bonuses is documented."
"We pivot," Susan said, tapping her pen precisely on the table. "We release the bonus disbursement schedule tonight. We announce that due to an unforeseen administrative error, a favorite phrase of mine, the Q3 bonuses were incorrectly slated for Q4, but will be dispersed immediately, effective tomorrow morning. We pay the $3 million back into the bonus pool." Davies frowned. "That costs us the liquidity we needed for the quarterly report projection." "It doesn't matter what the projection looks like if the CEO is facing a vote of no confidence," Susan snapped. "We prioritize the survival of Hale Global. Richard's image is secondary to the stock price. If we move fast, we can spin this delay as a minor corrected technical glitch and reinforce the idea that Hale Global immediately corrects its mistakes and cares for its employees." She looked at Chen. "You draft the press release. It needs to be proactive, apologetic about the technical error, and emphasize the immediate disbursement. We bury the story of the video with the story of the immediate correction. And under no circumstances do we mention that it was Richard's daughter who triggered the video. She's a minor, and dragging a child into this publicly would be disastrous." She then turned to Davies. "And you, Mr. Davies, you need to start discreetly evaluating the terms of Richard Hale's employment contract, specifically the clauses regarding material breach of fiduciary trust and reputational damage to the firm." Davies looked shocked. "Susan, are you suggesting we prepare to remove Richard?" "I am suggesting we prepare for every eventuality, Mr. Davies. Richard Hale built this house on sand. If the market smells weakness, they will tear the whole thing down. Our job is to protect the firm, not the man." Susan Park was now fully in control, the cold, powerful force that had always operated beneath Richard's flamboyant generosity. Richard Hale spent the next 2 hours in his office, not making calls, but pacing the expensive oriental rug, running his hands through his perfectly styled hair. He was trying to decide who to blame more: Emily, for the colossal stupidity of not understanding technology, or Henderson, the accountant, for not making the transfer cleaner. But every time his mind drifted to Emily, he felt an uncomfortable twist in his stomach. She was 10 years old.
She'd been crying, she'd been terrified, and he'd yelled at her like she was a corporate saboteur instead of a child who'd made an innocent mistake. He pushed the feeling away. He couldn't afford sentimentality right now. He finally called Henderson. "Henderson, I need you in my office now." Henderson arrived looking like he hadn't slept in a week, which was probably true. "Sir," Henderson managed, standing stiffly. "The bonuses," Richard said, his voice low and dangerous. "They know. The board saw the spreadsheet. They know the $3 million was moved." Henderson paled further. "Sir, I warned you about the paper trail." "I don't need your warnings, Henderson. I need solutions. We are going to put the money back now, today. I don't care what account you liquidate. I don't care how much interest we pay. Get that $3 million back into the Q3 bonus pool immediately, and draft a memo to HR stating it was a system error and the disbursement is scheduled for tomorrow morning." Henderson looked relieved, but also deeply troubled. "But sir, the liquidity." "To hell with liquidity. We are facing a shareholder revolt." Richard slammed his fist on the desk. "And Henderson, if anyone asks, you never discuss this with me. You were simply correcting a data entry mistake. Clear?" Henderson nodded frantically. "Understood, sir. I'll get started immediately." As Henderson scrambled out, Richard felt a momentary sense of relief. He could fix the money. He could fix the narrative. But then he remembered Emily. He remembered her small, tear-streaked face, the way she'd clutched that tablet like it could protect her from his anger. And he remembered that he'd taken it from her, that he'd ordered her into silence, that he'd treated his own daughter like a security threat. He picked up his office phone and dialed his home number. His wife, Margaret, answered on the second ring. "Richard, I just got a very confusing call from your assistant saying I need to pick up Emily immediately. What's going on?" "There was an incident at the office," Richard said carefully. "Emily accidentally played the wrong video during the board meeting. It was inappropriate content, confidential business material. She's upset, and I think it's best if she goes home early." "Confidential material? Richard, she's 10. What was she even doing with access to?" "Margaret, please, just come get her. We'll discuss it tonight." There was a long pause. "Is she okay? Did you yell at her?" Richard closed his eyes. "Just, please come get her." Margaret's voice turned cold. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. And Richard, we will be discussing this tonight." She hung up before he could respond. Richard leaned back in his chair, suddenly feeling the exhaustion of the day. He had to be the one to clean this up. He had to be the one to reassure the market. He was the pillar of the firm. But he also had to go home tonight and face his wife, who would ask him why their 10-year-old daughter was crying in the car, and why she'd said, "Daddy was really scary and mean." He decided he would make a public statement tonight. Something about the importance of transparency. Something about prioritizing their people. Something to pivot back to his core brand of goodness. He would turn the accident into an opportunity for demonstrating corporate responsibility.
He called Miss Chen. "Chen, I need you to draft a statement for me, a personal statement. It needs to be emotional, powerful, something about leadership, being accountable, about putting the employees first. We will frame the bonus issue as a test of our values, a test we immediately passed." "Mr. Hale," Miss Chen's voice was surprisingly cool, "I appreciate your input. However, Ms. Park has already directed the communications team to issue a comprehensive release addressing the administrative error and confirming the immediate disbursement schedule. It's going out within the hour." Richard's blood ran cold. Susan Park. She had gone around him. She was already executing a strategy without his input. "Put Susan on the phone," Richard demanded, his voice tight. "Miss Park is currently engaged in a confidential meeting with Mr. Davies, sir. She left instructions that all official communication regarding today's internal incident must be routed through her office." Richard hung up the phone slowly. The realization dawned on him. Susan wasn't just managing the crisis. She was managing him. He was no longer the moral authority of the firm. He was a liability being contained. Mark Lewis finally finished the compliance report he was supposed to be working on, though he barely remembered typing the words. It was late afternoon. His cube farm was emptying out. He checked his work email one last time before leaving. There it was, the internal memo from HR, titled, "Urgent,
Q3 bonus disbursement correction and immediate action. He opened it. It was exactly what Susan Park must have ordered. A boilerplate apology for a database synchronization failure that had temporarily delayed the payment schedule, followed by the firm's commitment to immediate disbursement. The bonuses would be in their accounts by 8 a.m. tomorrow.
Mark read the word error 3 times. It wasn't an error. It was a conscious decision by Richard Hale, recorded on video by his own daughter, who probably didn't even understand what she'd captured. He got his $4,000 back. His security deposit was safe. Sarah's IVF treatments were back on track. Richard Hale had been forced to pay. But the memo didn't mention the video. It didn't mention the reason for the error. It just reinforced the idea that Hale Global was competent and cared. Mark felt a profound sense of disappointment, not because he didn't get his money, but because the truth had been so expertly scrubbed away. The system had protected itself, absorbing the shock and spitting out a clean, palatable lie. And somewhere in that system, a 10-year-old girl had accidentally revealed the truth and was probably being punished for her innocence. He knew he should be relieved. He had his money, and he didn't have to risk his career. He packed his worn leather messenger bag, ready to head home. As he walked past the deserted area of the cubicles, he saw a small discarded piece of paper sticking out of the recycling bin near the printer. He paused, recognizing the distinctive font. It was the original draft of the HR memo about the strategic timing shift that had delayed the bonuses in the first place. Curiosity compelled him. He reached in, pulled out the crumpled paper, and smoothed it out. It contained the original, vague language that Richard Hale had ordered Henderson to use. Mark looked at the paper, then back at the clean, official email on his phone. He had 2 pieces of evidence now: the knowledge of the account codes from the video and the physical proof of the cover-up memo. He was just a junior compliance officer. He was supposed to follow the rules, but the rules, he now knew, were just another tool for Richard Hale to manage his image.
Mark quietly folded the crumpled memo and slid it into his pocket. He wasn't sure what he would do with it. Maybe nothing. But he realized that silence was no longer protection. It was complicity. He left the building, walking out onto the bustling Manhattan street, feeling the rush of the evening traffic. He was still underpaid, still unnoticed, but now he carried a tiny, inconvenient truth in his pocket. A truth that the entire infrastructure of Hale Global was working furiously to erase. Richard Hale might have fixed the balance sheets, but he hadn't fixed the damage he had done to the trust of the people who saw him exposed. And Mark Lewis was one of them, walking home with his rent money secured, but his faith in the system utterly destroyed. The real story, the one that wasn't going to be printed in tomorrow's papers, was only just beginning to unfold. That evening, in the Hale family's Upper East Side townhouse, Margaret Hale sat on Emily's bed, gently brushing her daughter's hair as the little girl sniffled and tried to explain what had happened. "I didn't mean to, Mommy," Emily said for the 10th time, her voice small and miserable. "I didn't know that other video was on there." "I know, sweetheart," Margaret said softly, her jaw tight with barely controlled anger, not at Emily, but at her husband. "It was an accident. You didn't do anything wrong." "But Daddy's really mad at me. He said I ruined everything. He said I cost the company lots of money." Emily's eyes filled with fresh tears. "He wouldn't even look at me when you picked me up. He just stayed in his office." Margaret set down the brush and pulled Emily into a hug. "Your father is dealing with a difficult situation at work, but that doesn't mean he should have spoken to you that way. You're a child. You made an honest mistake." "But Mommy," Emily said, pulling back to look at her mother with those 2 wise eyes that sometimes appeared in children who'd seen something they shouldn't have. "The video showed Daddy taking money from people who needed it. He said their bonuses could wait because he needed to look good for pictures. That's not a good thing to do, is it?" Margaret felt her heart break a little. Her 10-year-old daughter had just had her first real lesson in hypocrisy, and it had come from her own father. "No, sweetheart," Margaret said carefully. "It's not a good thing to do. But sometimes adults make mistakes too. Sometimes they make choices they shouldn't make. Is Daddy going to say sorry to those people?" Margaret thought about the memo she'd heard Richard angrily discussing on the phone earlier, the one calling it an administrative error. She thought about her husband, who would rather die than admit he'd made a moral mistake, who would spin and deflect and manage the narrative rather than simply apologize. "I don't know, Emily," she said honestly. "I really don't know." Emily was quiet for a moment, then said in a very small voice, "Mommy, I don't think I want to go to Daddy's office anymore. I don't like it there." "That's okay, sweetheart. You don't have to go if you don't want to." "And Mommy, when I grow up, I don't want to work at a place like that. I want to work somewhere where people are actually nice, not just pretend nice." Margaret held her daughter closer, feeling the weight of that simple, devastating observation. "Pretend nice," Emily had said. Out of the mouths of babes came the most uncomfortable truths. "You're a very smart girl, Emily," Margaret whispered, kissing the top of her daughter's head. "And you have a good heart. Don't ever let anyone take that away from you."
Downstairs, Margaret could hear the front door open and close. Richard was home. She heard his footsteps in the foyer, the familiar sound of his briefcase being set down, his keys dropped into the ceramic bowl on the console table. But he didn't call out. He didn't come upstairs to check on Emily. Margaret felt something harden in her chest. She had always known Richard was ambitious, that he was more concerned with appearances than substance. But she had told herself it was just the nature of his work, the pressure of running a major firm. She had rationalized it, excused it, even benefited from it with their comfortable lifestyle. But watching her 10-year-old daughter cry because her father had yelled at her for exposing his hypocrisy, that was a line crossed. "Try to get some sleep, sweetheart," Margaret said gently, tucking Emily under her covers. "Tomorrow will be better." Emily nodded, but her eyes were still worried. "Is Daddy going to be mad at me forever?" "No, honey, he's just confused right now. He'll come around." Margaret said the words, but she wasn't sure she believed them. She turned off the light and left Emily's room, pulling the door partially closed. Then she walked down the grand staircase, her footsteps deliberate and measured. Richard was in his study, standing by the window with a glass of scotch in his hand, staring out at the darkening street. He didn't turn when she entered. "You yelled at our 10-year-old daughter," Margaret said without preamble. Her voice was calm, but there was steel underneath. "She exposed confidential company information to the entire board of directors," Richard replied, still not turning around. "She humiliated me in front of the most important people in the firm." "She's 10 years old, Richard. She was playing with a tablet. It was an accident."
An accident that could cost me everything I've built. He finally turned, and Margaret could see the exhaustion in his face, the fear barely concealed beneath the anger. "Do you understand what happened today? My reputation, the entire foundation of this firm's value, was destroyed in 45 seconds by our daughter pressing the wrong button." "No," Margaret corrected him, her voice hardening. "Your reputation was destroyed by your own actions. Emily just showed people what you really are." Richard's jaw tightened. "What I really am? I'm a businessman, Margaret. I make difficult decisions that you couldn't possibly understand. The Newark project needed that funding to happen on schedule. It was a timing issue. You took money from your employees, money they were counting on, money they'd earned, so you could get positive press coverage. Don't dress it up as a timing issue, Richard. You chose your image over their livelihoods." "And I fixed it," Richard shot back. "The bonuses are being dispersed tomorrow. Everyone gets their money. Problem solved." "You only fixed it because you got caught. If Emily hadn't played that video, those people would still be waiting until next year for money you promised them this year, and you know it." Richard set his glass down hard on the side table. "What do you want from me, Margaret? You want me to fall on my sword, resign, destroy everything I've worked for? Is that what would make you happy?" "I want you to apologize to your daughter," Margaret said quietly. "She's upstairs right now, terrified that you hate her, thinking she's destroyed your life. She's 10 years old, Richard. She was excited to visit your office. She thought she was going to make people laugh with a silly video. Instead, she accidentally showed them the truth, and you punished her for it." "I didn't punish her. I was justifiably upset." "You told her she sabotaged everything you'd built. You told her she didn't understand anything.
You made her feel like she was the problem instead of your own actions. Margaret's voice cracked slightly. She told me she doesn't want to come to your office anymore. She said she doesn't want to work somewhere where people are pretend nice when she grows up. Do you understand what that means? Your 10-year-old daughter has already learned not to trust you. That hit him. Margaret could see it in the way his shoulders sagged slightly, the way his eyes flicked away from hers. I'll talk to her tomorrow, he muttered. No, Richard, you'll talk to her tonight. You'll go up there right now and you'll tell her you're sorry for yelling at her and that what happened wasn't her fault, because it wasn't. It was yours. Richard opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. He looked suddenly older, the carefully maintained facade of confidence cracking to reveal something more vulnerable underneath. And after you apologize to Emily, Margaret continued, her voice softer now, but no less firm, you and I are going to have a very serious conversation about what kind of man you want to be. Because the man I married wasn't someone who would sacrifice his employees' well-being for a photo opportunity. Or maybe he was, and I just didn't want to see it. She left him standing there and walked back upstairs, her heart pounding. She'd never spoken to Richard like that before. She'd always been the supportive wife, the gracious hostess, the woman who smiled and nodded and didn't ask too many questions about how the money was made. But she couldn't be that woman anymore. Not after seeing Emily's tear-stained face. Not after hearing her daughter say she wanted to work somewhere with people who are actually nice, not just pretend nice.
Richard stood in his study for a long time after Margaret left. The scotch sat untouched on the table. His reflection in the darkened window looked haggard, older than his 48 years. He thought about Emily, about the way she'd looked at him in the boardroom, confused, then horrified, then terrified. He'd seen that look before, but never directed at him. It was the look people gave when they realized someone they trusted had betrayed them. The worst part was that she hadn't even understood what she was exposing. She'd just been trying to share something funny, to participate in the adult world she found so fascinating, and he'd treated her like an enemy combatant. Richard climbed the stairs slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last. He paused outside Emily's door, hearing the soft sounds of her breathing. She wasn't asleep. The breathing was too irregular, too careful. He knocked softly. "Emily, can I come in?" There was a long pause. Then, in a very small voice, "Okay." He pushed open the door. Emily was lying in bed, facing the wall, her small body curled up tight. Her favorite stuffed rabbit, Mr. Hopsworth, a ridiculous name she'd given it when she was 5, was clutched against her chest. Richard sat down carefully on the edge of her bed. "Emily, I need to talk to you." "I know I'm in trouble," she whispered, still not turning around. "I'm really sorry, Daddy. I promise I won't ever touch your work stuff again." "You're not in trouble," Richard said, and the words felt strange in his mouth. "I mean, you're not in trouble with me. I'm the one who should apologize." That made her turn over. Her face was blotchy from crying, her eyes red and swollen. She looked at him with such uncertainty, such wariness, that it broke something inside him.
"I shouldn't have yelled at you," Richard continued, forcing the words out. "What happened today wasn't your fault. You didn't know what was on that video. You were just trying to share something fun with everyone, and I reacted badly." Emily sat up a little, wiping her nose with her pajama sleeve. "But I did ruin everything. You said so." "I was wrong to say that. You didn't ruin anything. You're 10 years old, sweetheart. You made a mistake with technology. That's all. What happened today was complicated, but it wasn't because of you. The people in that video, the ones who didn't get their money," Emily said hesitantly, "are they going to be okay now?" Richard swallowed hard. "Yes, they're getting their money tomorrow." "Because of what happened? Because everyone saw the video?" He wanted to lie, to deflect, to explain it away with corporate jargon she wouldn't understand. But looking at his daughter's earnest, worried face, he found he couldn't. "Yes," he admitted, "because everyone saw the video." Emily was quiet for a moment, processing this. Then she said, "So, if I hadn't played it by accident, those people would still be waiting for their money?" "Emily?"
And you would still be getting your picture taken, pretending you were doing good things? The simple, devastating accuracy of her observation left him speechless. She wasn't accusing him. She was just trying to understand. And somehow, that made it worse. It's more complicated than that, Richard said weakly. Running a company means making difficult choices about. Mr. Henderson looked really scared in that video, Emily interrupted, her voice small. And you were being mean to him. You don't usually sound like that. You sounded like a different person.
Richard felt something twist in his chest. Out of everything, the board meeting, the exposure, the damage control, this was somehow the hardest moment. His 10-year-old daughter had seen behind the mask, and she was smart enough to recognize it for what it was. Sometimes, he said slowly, carefully, adults don't act the way they should. Sometimes we make choices that hurt people because we're focused on other things. And sometimes we forget that the choices we make affect real people with real lives. Like Mr. Lewis? Emily asked. I saw him in the meeting today. He looked really sad after the video played. You noticed Mark Lewis? Richard was surprised. He could barely remember what Mark Lewis looked like, even though the man worked for his firm. He was sitting in the back. He had a really old briefcase, and his suit didn't fit very good. And when you said that thing about the bonuses on the video, he looked like he was going to cry. Emily's eyes were too observant, too understanding for a 10-year-old. Is Mr. Lewis one of the people who needed that money? Richard didn't answer immediately. He was thinking about Mark Lewis, a name he'd seen on personnel reports but never really registered as a human being. How many Mark Lewises were there in his company? How many people were counting on promises he'd casually broken for a news cycle? Probably, he finally admitted. Then I'm glad I played the video by accident, Emily said firmly, even if you got mad at me, because now Mr. Lewis gets his money. Richard looked at his daughter, his small, principled, heartbreakingly honest daughter, and felt something crack open inside him. She was glad she'd exposed him, not because she wanted to hurt him, but because it meant someone like Mark Lewis would get what he'd been promised. When had he stopped thinking about the Mark Lewises of the world? When had his focus shifted so completely from the people doing the work to the image he projected?
You have a good heart, Emily, Richard said quietly. Don't ever lose that. Don't ever let anyone, not even me, convince you that doing the right thing doesn't matter. Emily studied him carefully, her 10-year-old brain trying to reconcile the angry, scary man from earlier with this softer, sadder version sitting on her bed. Are you going to keep being mean to people like Mr. Henderson, taking money they need? No, Richard said. And as he said it, he realized he wasn't entirely sure if it was a promise or just another lie he was telling to make her feel better. I'm going to try to do better. Emily nodded slowly, then did something that surprised him. She reached out and hugged him, a quick, tentative hug, like she wasn't sure if he'd push her away. Richard hugged her back, holding his daughter and feeling the weight of everything he'd built, everything he'd compromised, everything he'd pretended to be. And for the first time in years, he felt truly, profoundly ashamed. I love you, Daddy, Emily whispered against his shoulder. I love you too, sweetheart, he whispered back. I'm sorry I forgot that today. He stayed there for a few more minutes, until Emily's breathing evened out and she finally fell asleep. Then he carefully extracted himself, tucked Mr. Hapsworth beside her, and turned off the bedside lamp. As he stood in the doorway, looking at his sleeping daughter, Richard made a decision. He wasn't sure yet what it would mean or how far he was willing to go, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He couldn't keep being the man in that video, not if he wanted to be able to look Emily in the eye and call himself her father. The next morning, the Hale Global office buzzed with a different kind of energy. The news had spread, not through official channels, but through the whispered network of people who'd been in that meeting or heard about it from someone who had. Mark Lewis arrived at 7:30 a.m., earlier than usual. He checked his bank account on his phone as he rode the elevator up. There it was, the direct deposit, right on schedule. $4,216. His Q3 performance bonus, delivered exactly as promised in the revised memo. He should have felt relieved.
He should have felt satisfied that justice, however accidentally, had been served. Instead, he felt hollow. The money was there because Richard Hale had been caught, not because Richard Hale had cared. The system had protected itself, smoothed over the scandal, and returned to business as usual. And somewhere in a mansion on the Upper East Side, a 10-year-old girl was probably being told to never speak about what she'd seen again. Mark sat at his desk and pulled out the crumpled memo he'd taken from the recycling bin. He smoothed it out on his desk, reading the language again. Strategic timing adjustment. It sounded so professional, so reasonable. Nothing like the reality of families counting on that money for rent, for medical bills, for the basic promise that their hard work would be rewarded. Sarah appeared at his cubicle entrance, holding 2 cups of coffee. She offered him one without speaking. "Thanks," Mark said, accepting it. "I saw the deposit," Sarah said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one else was nearby. "The IVF treatment's back on." "That's good. That's really good, Sarah. But it doesn't feel good, does it?" She leaned against the cubicle wall, her expression troubled. "We only got our money because his daughter accidentally exposed him. If she hadn't, we'd still be waiting until Q1, Mark finished, and Richard Hale would still be cutting ribbons at community centers, smiling for cameras. "So what do we do?" Sarah asked. "Just pretend it didn't happen, cash our checks, and move on?" Mark looked down at the crumpled memo on his desk, then back up at Sarah. "I don't know. I honestly don't know."
But even as he said it, he felt the weight of the memo in his pocket, the knowledge of the account codes in his memory, and the growing certainty that silence wasn't neutrality. Silence was choosing a side. And he wasn't sure he could keep choosing Richard Hale's side, even if it meant keeping his job. In his corner office, Richard sat at his desk, staring at the polished surface where, just days ago, he'd pointed at that damning spreadsheet while his daughter's tablet recorded every word. The crisis was contained, the bonuses had been paid, the official statement had been released, blaming a database synchronization error that had been immediately corrected. The stock price had dipped slightly in pre-market trading but stabilized by mid-morning. Susan Park had sent him a terse email. Damage controlled. Monitoring ongoing. Everything should have felt back to normal. But Richard couldn't shake the image of Emily's face, the way she'd said, "Mr. Lewis looked like he was going to cry." He couldn't forget the simple, crushing accuracy of her observation. "So if I hadn't played it by accident, those people would still be waiting for their money?" His desk phone buzzed. "Mr. Hale, you have a 9 o'clock with the investor relations team," his assistant reminded him. "Thank you, Mrs. Chen." He should prepare for that meeting. He should review the talking points Susan had prepared, memorize the narrative about the firm's commitment to its people, practice looking sincere while explaining away yesterday's uncomfortable truth. Instead, he found himself pulling up the employee directory on his computer. He typed in Mark Lewis. There he was, Junior Compliance Officer, employee number 4782. Hired 3 years ago, bachelor's degree from a state school, annual salary $67,000. Richard did some quick mental math. After taxes, student loan payments, New York City rent, Mark Lewis was probably barely getting by. That $4,000 bonus wasn't a nice extra. It was essential. And Richard had taken it, casually, confidently, with no thought to the Mark Lewises of the world who actually needed it. He pulled up more employee files. Sarah Chen, analyst. Michael Rodriguez, junior accountant. Jennifer Park, operations coordinator. Page after page of people he'd never met, never spoken to, people whose bonuses he'd delayed with a casual wave of his hand because he needed better optics for a charitable donation. The charitable donation. Richard pulled up the Newark Housing Project file. The $3 million had built 20 affordable housing units. 20 families now had clean, safe places to live. The photos showed children playing, parents smiling, hope restored. It was real good, genuine impact, lives changed for the better. But it had been purchased with broken promises to his own employees. He'd robbed Peter to pay Paul, then held a press conference to celebrate his generosity to Paul while Peter waited for the paycheck he'd earned. For the first time, Richard truly understood what his daughter had seen in that video. Not just a business decision, a betrayal. His door opened without a knock. Susan Park walked in, tablet in hand, her expression unreadable. "We need to talk," she said, closing the door behind her. "Good morning to you too, Susan." "The crisis is contained for now," she said, ignoring his attempt at normalcy. "But we need to discuss long-term strategy. The board is concerned." "About what? The bonuses were paid, the statement was released, the stock is stable." "The board is concerned about you, Richard." Susan sat down across from him, her eyes sharp and assessing. "Yesterday exposed a fundamental disconnect between your public image and your private decision-making. That disconnect is a liability." "It was one decision, Susan, one moment of poor judgment captured on video by my 10-year-old daughter."
Was it? Susan leaned forward. Or was it simply the one time you got caught? Because if I audit the last 5 years of your charitable initiatives, how many times will I find similar trade-offs? How many employee programs were cut to fund public donations? How many operational improvements were delayed to maintain your image? Richard felt his jaw tighten. My image, as you call it, is what keeps the investors confident. It's what allows this firm to command premium valuations. Everything I've done has been in the best interest of Hale Global. Has it? Susan pulled up something on her tablet and turned it toward him. This is internal polling data from yesterday afternoon. We discreetly surveyed 50 employees across different departments and seniority levels. The question was simple. Do you trust senior leadership to prioritize employee welfare? The results dropped 17 percentage points compared to our last quarterly survey. 17 points, Richard, in one day. Richard stared at the numbers. People have short memories. This will blow over. Perhaps your daughter accidentally revealed something that employees have suspected for years. That the benevolent CEO image is just that, an image. And once that illusion is broken, Richard, it's very difficult to rebuild. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that you have a choice to make. Susan pulled back her tablet. You can continue as you have been, managing the optics, making the trade-offs, hoping you don't get caught again. Or you can actually become the person you've been pretending to be. That's easy for you to say. You don't have to worry about... I don't have to worry about anything, Susan interrupted, her voice cold. I'm not the one whose reputation was shattered by a 10-year-old's tablet. I'm not the one whose daughter thinks he's pretend nice. I'm not the one whose wife is 3 steps away from calling a divorce lawyer.
That last comment hit him like a physical blow. How do you... I make it my business to know everything that could affect this firm, Richard, and right now, you're the biggest risk factor we have. So yes, you have a choice to make, and you need to make it soon, because the board is losing patience, your employees are losing faith, and your family is losing respect for you. Susan stood up, smoothing her perfectly pressed skirt. The investor relations meeting is in 30 minutes. I suggest you spend that time deciding who you want to be when you walk into that room. The man in the video, or the man you've been pretending to be all these years? She left without waiting for a response, the door closing with a soft, final click. Richard sat alone in his office, surrounded by the symbols of his success, the awards, the photos with dignitaries, the framed articles praising his philanthropy. All of it suddenly felt like evidence in a trial, proof of an elaborate deception he'd perpetrated on the world and on himself. He thought about Emily, asking if he was going to keep being mean to people like Mr. Henderson. He thought about Margaret, telling him he needed to decide what kind of man he wanted to be. He thought about Mark Lewis, sitting in the back of that boardroom, watching his promised bonus disappear for the sake of a photo opportunity. And he thought about himself, the man he'd been when he started Hale Global 20 years ago, full of genuine ambition and real ideals. When had that man disappeared? When had the image become more important than the reality? The phone buzzed again, the investor relations meeting. Richard picked up his papers, straightened his tie, and stood up. He looked at his reflection in the glass wall of his office. Polished, professional, perfect. Pretend nice, his daughter had called it. He took a deep breath, then walked toward the conference room, still not entirely sure which version of himself he was bringing to that meeting. The man in the video, or the man he'd been pretending to be. Or, possibly, a third option he hadn't yet considered.
the man he actually needed to become. The investor relations meeting was held in the smaller conference room, the one with less dramatic views but more intimate seating. Richard entered to find 6 faces already waiting for him, senior investors who collectively controlled about 40% of Hale Global's outstanding shares. They weren't smiling. Richard took his seat at the head of the table, spreading his prepared notes in front of him. Susan Park sat to his right, her expression carefully neutral. "Gentlemen, thank you for coming on short notice," Richard began, his voice steady. "I know yesterday's incident raised some concerns." "Incident?" interrupted James Morrison, a silver-haired investor who'd been with the firm since the beginning. "Richard, you were caught on video deliberately delaying employee bonuses to fund a public relations opportunity. That's not an incident, that's a scandal." "A scandal that was immediately corrected," Susan interjected smoothly. "The bonuses were dispersed on an accelerated schedule. The employees have been made whole, and our official statement addressed the administrative oversight." "Administrative oversight?" Another investor, Carol Zhang, leaned forward. "I've reviewed the internal communications. The delay wasn't an oversight. It was a calculated decision that got exposed by the CEO's daughter accidentally playing a recording during a board meeting. That's not oversight, Miss Park. That's spectacular incompetence in operational security."
Richard felt his carefully prepared talking points disintegrating. The core facts remain unchanged. Hale Global delivered on its commitments, both to the Newark community and to our employees. The timing was unfortunate, but "The timing was everything," Morrison interrupted again. "Richard, your entire value proposition to this firm is your reputation. You're not the best investor, you're not the most innovative strategist, but you are, or were, the moral face of this company. That face was just revealed to be a mask. So what do we have left?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Richard opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked down at his notes, carefully crafted sentences about integrity, commitment, and values. All of it suddenly sounded hollow. "You have a choice to make," Morrison continued, his voice softer now but no less serious. "You can try to rebuild the image, spend millions on reputation management, and hope people forget what they saw. Or you can actually change, fundamentally change how this company operates." "Change how?" Richard asked. "Stop treating employees as line items and the public as an audience," said Carol Zhang bluntly. "Start treating them both as stakeholders who deserve honest dealing. That means no more robbing Peter to pay Paul. That means transparent decision-making. That means if you make a commitment, you keep it, regardless of how it affects your photo opportunities." "That's a dramatic shift in corporate culture," Susan observed. "Yes, it is," Morrison agreed. "But it's the only way to salvage what happened yesterday. Because right now, Richard, you're a liability. The board is discussing succession planning. They're debating whether to remove you as CEO." Richard felt the words hit him like a physical blow. "Remove me? From the company I built?"
"From the leadership position in the company you built," Morrison corrected. "You'd remain on the board, obviously. You'd maintain your equity stake, but the board is questioning whether you can effectively lead after yesterday's exposure." "Susan," Richard turned to her, desperate now, "you said the damage was controlled." "I said it was contained," Susan corrected him coolly. "Containment isn't resolution, Richard. It's just buying time to figure out what the actual resolution should be." Richard looked around the table at these faces, people who'd trusted him, invested in him, believed in the brand he'd built. And now they were discussing his removal with the clinical detachment of surgeons, deciding whether to amputate. "How much time do I have?" he asked quietly. 30 days, Morrison said. "The board will meet again in 30 days to evaluate whether you're still the right person to lead Hale Global. Between now and then, they'll be watching how you handle this. They'll be looking for signs that yesterday was an aberration or confirmation that it's who you've been all along." "What about the investors, the market confidence?" "That depends on what happens in the next 30 days, Carol Zhang said. "If you demonstrate genuine change, not just PR spin, but actual operational and ethical change, investor confidence can be rebuilt. If you double down on the image management game, confidence will erode further. It's that simple." Morrison stood up, gathering his papers. "Richard, I've known you for 20 years. I remember when you started this firm with real ideals and genuine passion.
Somewhere along the way, you got lost in the performance of being good rather than the practice of being good. Your daughter just gave you an opportunity to find your way back. I suggest you take it." The other investors filed out, leaving Richard alone with Susan Park. "Well," Susan said after a long moment, "that was illuminating."
"They're going to remove me," Richard said, his voice hollow. "After everything I've built, they're going to push me out because of one mistake." "One mistake that crystallized years of questionable priorities," Susan corrected him. "Richard, they're right. You've been so focused on managing perception that you've neglected reality, and yesterday, reality caught up with you in the form of your 10-year-old daughter's tablet." "So what do I do?" Susan stood up, gathering her tablet. "That's not my decision to make. I can manage crises, Richard, but I can't fix character. That's something you have to figure out for yourself." She paused at the door. "Though if you want my professional opinion, start by actually listening to what your daughter saw in that video. She's 10 years old, and she understood something that you've been avoiding for years. There's a difference between looking good and being good. Figure out which one matters more to you." She left, and Richard sat alone in the conference room, the morning sun streaming through the windows, illuminating the empty chairs around the table. 30 days. He had 30 days to prove he deserved to keep leading the company he'd built. The question was, did he even know how to be the person they needed him to be? 3 days later, Mark Lewis was working late again. It had become a habit, staying in the office after everyone else left, ostensibly to catch up on compliance reports, but really just to avoid going home to his cramped apartment where he'd have too much time to think. The crumpled memo was still in his desk drawer. He'd taken it out several times, smoothed it flat, read the corporate doublespeak again and again. Strategic timing adjustment. It made him angrier every time he read it. His phone buzzed, a text from Sarah. "Coffee tomorrow morning? Need to talk." Mark texted back, "Sure, 7:30? Perfect." He was about to pack up when he heard footsteps in the hallway. That was unusual. It was nearly 8 p.m., well past when even the most dedicated employees usually stayed. The footsteps stopped at his cubicle entrance. Mark looked up and froze. Richard Hale stood there, looking distinctly uncomfortable. He wasn't wearing his usually perfectly tailored suit jacket, just the white dress shirt and loosened tie. He looked tired, older somehow than he had at the board meeting. "Mr. Lewis," Richard said, "I'm sorry to intrude. Do you have a few minutes?" Mark's mind raced. This couldn't be good. Had someone seen him take the memo? Did they know he'd been questioning the official narrative? "Of course, Mr. Hale," Mark said, trying to keep his voice steady. "What can I do for you?" Richard glanced around the empty office, then back at Mark. "I wanted to talk to you about what happened at the board meeting, about the video." Mark's stomach dropped. "Sir, I haven't discussed that with anyone outside the company. I understand the confidentiality." "That's not why I'm here," Richard interrupted. He pulled over a chair from an empty cubicle and sat down, which was somehow more unsettling than if he'd remained standing. "I'm here because my daughter told me something. She said she saw you in the meeting. She said you looked like you were going to cry when you heard about the bonus delay." Mark felt his face flush. He'd thought he'd kept his reaction hidden, apparently not well enough to escape the notice of a 10-year-old girl. "I was just surprised by the information," Mark said carefully. "You were counting on that bonus, weren't you?" Richard asked. It wasn't an accusation, just a question. Mark hesitated. Everything in his corporate survival instincts told him to deflect, to minimize, to not make waves. But something about Richard Hale sitting in his cubicle at 8 p.m., looking genuinely troubled, made him decide on honesty.
"Yes," Mark said simply. "I was counting on it. I had plans for that money. Important plans." "Like what?" "Like moving out of the apartment I share with 2 roommates. Like making a dent in my student loans. Like maybe having some emergency savings for the first time in 3 years." Mark felt a flash of anger break through his carefully maintained professional demeanor. "Nothing dramatic, Mr. Hale, just basic financial stability." Richard nodded slowly, as if absorbing this information. "I didn't think about that. When I made the decision to delay the bonuses, I didn't think about the actual people it would affect. I just saw numbers on a spreadsheet." "With respect, sir,
That's obvious. Richard looked up sharply, but Mark didn't flinch. He'd already crossed the line by speaking honestly. Might as well commit to it. You want to know what my daughter said to me? Richard asked after a moment. She asked if I was going to keep being mean to people like Henderson, taking money they needed. She's 10 years old, and she understood something I'd lost sight of, that these aren't just numbers, they're people's lives. Why are you telling me this? Mark asked. Because I'm trying to figure out how to fix it. Not the optics, not the corporate spin, the actual problem. And I realized I don't actually know what the problem is, not really, because I've spent so many years insulated from the people who actually work here. So I'm asking you, Mr. Lewis, if you could change one thing about how this company operates, what would it be? Mark stared at him, trying to determine if this was a trap, but Richard Hale looked genuinely interested in his answer. One thing? Mark said slowly. I'd make the leadership actually talk to the employees. Not in town halls where you give speeches and we applaud. Real conversations. About what's working, what's not, what we need. Because right now, there's this enormous gap between the executive floor and everyone else. You make decisions that affect our lives, and you don't even know our names. I know your name now, Richard said quietly, because your daughter pointed me out. If that video hadn't played, would you have ever learned my name? Would you have ever thought about how your decisions affected me specifically, as a person? Richard didn't answer immediately. Finally, he said, No, I wouldn't have. And that's the problem, isn't it? Mark nodded. That's the problem. Richard stood up, then paused. I have 30 days to prove to the board that I can actually lead this company effectively. 30 days to show them that yesterday was a wake-up call, not a character revelation. I'm not asking for your help or your sympathy. I'm just asking, if I actually change things, will it matter? Or is the damage already done? Mark thought about the memo in his drawer, the evidence of the cover-up. He thought about Sarah and her IVF treatments, about all the other employees who'd been treated as expendable variables in Richard Hale's reputation management equation. It depends, Mark said finally. If you change things because you want to save your job, people will know. They'll see through it. But if you change things because you actually understand why what you did was wrong, then maybe it matters. How will people know the difference?
Because actions speak louder than words, Mr. Hale. And we've had a lot of words from leadership over the years. Beautiful words about values and commitment and community. But when it came down to it, you took our bonuses to fund a photo op. So if you want people to believe you've changed, you're going to have to prove it. Consistently. Over time. Not with grand gestures, but with everyday decisions. Richard nodded slowly. Thank you for your honesty, Mr. Lewis. I know it probably wasn't easy to be this direct with your CEO. Former CEO, potentially, Mark said, then immediately regretted his bluntness. But Richard just gave a tired smile. Yes, potentially former CEO, which is perhaps what I deserve. He started to leave, then turned back. For what it's worth, I'm sorry. I'm sorry I took money you'd earned. I'm sorry I made you feel expendable. And I'm sorry it took my daughter accidentally exposing me for me to realize what I'd become. He left before Mark could respond. This moment right here is crucial, a CEO actually listening to an employee. If you're invested in seeing whether Richard's transformation is genuine, make sure you're subscribed, because the next chapters reveal whether his actions matches his words. Mark sat in his cubicle for a long time after Richard Hale's footsteps faded down the hallway. Then he pulled out the crumpled memo from his drawer, looked at it one more time,
and made a decision. He wouldn't destroy it, not yet, but he wouldn't weaponize it either. He'd keep it as a reminder of what had happened, of what could happen again if people like Richard Hale forgot the lessons they'd learned. But he'd give Richard Hale his 30 days. He'd watch to see if the change was real. And if it wasn't, well, Mark would still have the evidence.
The following Monday, Richard Hale called an all-staff meeting. Not a town hall with carefully staged Q&A, but an actual meeting where he announced he'd be spending the next month doing something unprecedented, working 1 day a week in different departments, doing the actual work alongside regular employees. The announcement was met with skepticism. Photo op, someone muttered in the back. Damage control, whispered another. But the next day, Richard Hale showed up in the compliance department wearing business casual and asking Mark Lewis to show him how to run a basic audit report. He was terrible at it. He couldn't navigate the software, he didn't understand the regulatory codes, and he asked questions that revealed just how disconnected he'd been from the actual operations of his company. But he showed up, and he kept showing up. The second week, he spent a day with Sarah Chen in analytics, learning how to build financial models and understanding the pressure analysts face to deliver perfect projections on impossible deadlines. The third week, he worked in operations, processing routine transactions and discovering that the streamlined systems his company boasted about were actually clunky, outdated interfaces that wasted hours of employee time every day. And every Friday, he held an open feedback session where anyone could come talk to him about problems, suggestions, or concerns. No PR team, no prepared responses, just Richard Hale, a notepad, and whoever showed up. At first, only a few brave souls attended, but word spread. He actually listened, he took notes, he followed up. If you're rooting for this redemption arc, or skeptical it's real, let me know in the comments. And hey, if this story is resonating with you, share it with someone who needs to hear about accountability and second chances.
When someone complained about the broken HVAC system in the East Wing that maintenance kept forgetting to fix, Richard personally called the building manager and got it repaired within 3 days. When an employee mentioned that the employee assistance program had been cut 2 years ago, making it impossible for people to access mental health services, Richard reinstated it and expanded it. None of it was flashy, none of it made headlines, but slowly, something began to shift in the culture of Hale Global. Meanwhile, Emily Hale was having her own journey of understanding. She'd gone back to school the week after the incident, terrified that somehow everyone would know what she'd done, that she'd be the girl who ruined her father's company. But, of course, her classmates knew nothing about board meetings or bonus delays. They cared about recess and who had the best snacks and whether Mrs. Patterson was going to assign homework over the weekend. Emily tried to settle back into her normal routine, but she found she couldn't stop thinking about the video, about Mr. Henderson looking scared, about Mr. Lewis looking sad, about her father's voice, so different from the daddy voice she knew at home. One afternoon, during a lesson about community helpers, her teacher, Mrs. Patterson, asked the class what they wanted to be when they grew up. "I want to be a doctor," shouted Tommy. "I want to be a vet," said Sarah. "I want to be a professional soccer player," declared Marcus. When it was Emily's turn, she said quietly, "I want to be someone who helps people, really helps them, not just pretends to help them." Mrs. Patterson gave her an odd look. "That's very thoughtful, Emily. What do you mean by really helps versus pretends to help?"
Emily thought about the best way to explain it without breaking her father's rule about not talking about what happened. I mean, some people do nice things so other people will say they're nice, but I want to do nice things just because they're the right things to do, even if nobody knows about it. Mrs. Patterson smiled warmly. "That's a very mature perspective, Emily. I think that's a wonderful goal." At recess, Emily's best friend Sophia asked her if she was okay. "You've been really quiet since you went to your dad's office that day. Did something bad happen?" Emily hesitated. Her father had told her not to talk about it. But Sophia was her best friend, and Emily felt like she was carrying something too heavy for a 10-year-old to carry alone. "I found out that grown-ups sometimes do bad things," Emily said carefully. "Even grown-ups who seem really good. And it's confusing because I don't know what to think about it." Sophia nodded sagely, even though she was also only 10. "My mom says that everybody makes mistakes, even adults. She says the important thing is if they say sorry and try to do better."
But what if they only try to do better because they got caught? Emily asked. That stumped Sophia. I don't know. I guess maybe it still counts. Like, my brother only cleans his room when Mom says she'll take away his video games, but the room still gets clean. Emily thought about this. It was a simple way of looking at it, but maybe not entirely wrong. Her father was trying to change, even if it was because of the video. Did the motivation matter if the result was that people like Mr. Lewis got their money? She wasn't sure, but she was starting to understand that grown-up problems didn't always have easy answers. At home, the Hale family was also going through changes. Margaret had stopped pretending everything was fine. She'd started asking Richard direct questions about his work, about his decisions, about the values he was actually practicing versus the values he was performing. At first, Richard had been defensive, but gradually he'd started answering honestly. He told her about his visits to different departments, about the broken HVAC system, about the compliance software that was so outdated it drove Mark Lewis crazy. He told her about conversations with employees who'd been too scared to speak up before, who were now cautiously sharing their concerns because Richard Hale was actually listening. And he told her about his fear. Fear that it was too little, too late. Fear that the board would remove him anyway. Fear that even if he changed everything about how he ran the company, his daughter would always remember him as the man in that video. Cold, calculating, cruel. She won't, Margaret said one night, as they sat in the living room after Emily had gone to bed. Children are remarkably forgiving, Richard. But you have to give her something to forgive you for besides just that one day. You have to show her who you're becoming, not just apologize for who you were. I don't know if I can become the person she needs me to be, Richard admitted. I've spent so long building this image, Margaret. I don't know if there's anything real underneath it anymore. Then you have to find out, Margaret said firmly. Not for the board, not for the investors, not even for the employees, for Emily. For our daughter who needs to know that when people make mistakes, they can actually change. That's the lesson she needs to learn from this. Not that her father is perfect, but that he's capable of growth. Richard looked at his wife, really looked at her, and realized she'd been seeing him clearly all along. She'd known what he was, what he'd become, and she'd been waiting for him to see it too.
I'm sorry, he said, for all of it, for putting my reputation ahead of our family, for making you complicit in something you didn't believe in. Margaret took his hand. I'm complicit too, Richard. I enjoyed the lifestyle. I didn't ask hard questions because I didn't want to know the answers. But Emily forced us both to confront the truth. Now we have to decide what we do with it. Upstairs, Emily lay in bed with Mr. Hopsworth tucked under her arm, listening to the soft murmur of her parents' voices through the floor. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was different than it had been, less tense, more honest. She thought about her father coming to her room that night, apologizing. She thought about the way he'd looked at her during breakfast this morning, really looked at her, asked her about school, listened to her talk about her science project. He was trying. She could see that. She didn't fully understand everything that had happened, all the complicated grown-up stuff about money and reputations and board meetings, but she understood that her father had done something wrong, and now he was trying to make it right. And maybe, Emily thought as she drifted off to sleep, that was what growing up was about. Not about never making mistakes, but about what you did after you made them. 28 days after the board meeting incident, Richard Hale sat in his office preparing for the final board evaluation. He had 2 days left before they made their decision. Susan Park entered without knocking, which had become her habit, but this time she was smiling. I have some data you'll want to see, she said, pulling up a presentation on his screen. It was another employee survey, the same one she'd shown him a month ago that had revealed a 17-point drop in employee trust. This time, the numbers told a different story. Trust in senior leadership, up 12 points. Belief that the company values its employees, up 15 points.
Willingness to recommend Hale Global as a place to work, up 19 points. It's working, Susan said simply. Whatever you've been doing for the past month, the department rotations, the open feedback sessions, the operational changes, It's working. People are starting to believe that the change might be real. Starting to believe, Richard noted, not fully convinced. Rome wasn't built in a day, Richard. You spent years building a certain reputation. It'll take more than a month to completely rebuild trust, but this is a good start. Susan paused. A very good start. What about the board? I've been having back-channel conversations with key members. Morrison is impressed. Zhang thinks you're showing genuine growth. The others are cautiously optimistic. Susan sat down across from him. You'll need to present a compelling case in 2 days, but you have evidence now, real data showing that your changes are having a positive impact. Richard looked at the members on the screen. They were good numbers. They suggested he might actually keep his job. But for the first time, he found himself asking a different question. Did he deserve to keep his job? He'd spent a month learning what he should have known all along. He'd listened to employees who shouldn't have needed a crisis to be heard. He'd fixed problems that should never have been allowed to exist in the first place. Susan, he said slowly, if the board does decide to remove me, who would they replace me with? Susan raised an eyebrow. That's an odd question. Are you preparing for the worst? I'm preparing for all possibilities. So who? Most likely candidate would be David Chen. He's been running operations for 8 years, he's well respected internally, and he has the institutional knowledge to maintain stability. David Chen, Richard repeated. The man who's been telling me for 3 years that we need to update our compliance software, and I kept saying it wasn't a budget priority.
The very same. Richard nodded slowly. Set up a meeting with him for tomorrow. I want to talk to him about operational improvements that should be prioritized, regardless of what the board decides. Susan looked at him with something that might have been respect. You're actually considering stepping down, aren't you? I'm considering what's best for the company, Richard said, which is something I should have been doing all along. That evening, Richard came home early for the first time in months. He found Emily in the living room, working on a school project, a diorama about community helpers. What are you building? He asked, sitting down next to her on the floor. It's a community center, Emily said, carefully gluing a small figure into place. Like the one you helped build in Newark. Mrs. Patterson said we should make a project about people who help the community. Richard felt a complex mix of emotions. That's a good project. I know the Newark Center was important, Emily said, not looking up from her gluing. Mommy explained it to me. She said families needed homes and your company helped them. But, she trailed off. But what? Richard prompted gently. But you could have helped them without taking money from people like Mr. Lewis, right? Like there was probably enough money to do both things? Out of the mouths of babes, Richard thought. Yes, he admitted. There was enough money to do both things. I made a choice that hurt our own employees because I wanted the Newark project to happen on a specific timeline for the wrong reasons. Emily finally looked up at him. Because you wanted to look good? Yes, because I wanted to look good. She nodded, absorbing this. Sophia says everybody makes mistakes. She says the important thing is if you say sorry and try to do better. Sophia's a smart friend.
But I think, Emily continued, her 10-year-old face serious and thoughtful, that it's also important why you're trying to do better. Like, are you doing it because you really understand what you did was wrong, or just because you got in trouble? Richard looked at his daughter, his brilliant, observant, painfully honest daughter, and realized she'd been grappling with the same questions he'd been asking himself for the past month. I think, he said carefully, it started as the second thing. I started trying to change because I got caught, because my job was at risk, because I was in trouble. But somewhere along the way, it became the first thing. I actually started to understand why what I did was wrong. Not just that it looked bad, but that it was bad, that it hurt real people who deserved better from me. Emily studied his face, as if trying to determine if he was telling the truth. Mr. Lewis got his money, right? He did. Everyone got their bonuses. And you're not going to do that again? Take money from your workers to make yourself look good? No, I'm not going to do that again. Okay, Emily said, and went back to her gluing. Then, after a moment, Daddy, can I ask you something? Of course. When you were in your office talking to Mr. Henderson, when I was recording without knowing it, did you know I was there? Richard felt his throat tighten. No, sweetheart,
I didn't. I was sitting on your couch for a whole hour, Emily said softly. I was being really quiet because I didn't want to bother you during your important work call, but you never looked over at me even once. Not even when you hung up. Richard closed his eyes. I'm sorry, Emily. I was so focused on my work that I didn't see you, and that's part of the problem, isn't it? I was so focused on the performance of being successful that I stopped seeing the people right in front of me, including my own daughter.
I forgive you, Emily said simply. But Daddy, maybe you could try to remember to look around more, like actually see the people who are there, not just the ones who are supposed to be there for work stuff. That's good advice, Richard said, his voice rough with emotion. Really good advice. Emily went back to her diorama, and Richard sat with her, helping her place tiny trees and benches, letting his daughter teach him about seeing what was actually in front of him, instead of just what he expected to see. Later, when Emily had gone to bed, Margaret found Richard in his study, but instead of working on his board presentation, he was writing something by hand. "What's that?" she asked. "A letter," Richard said. "To the board. I'm going to present it in 2 days, along with the data about the changes we've made." "What kind of letter?" Richard set down his pen and looked at his wife. "I'm going to tell them the truth. Not the sanitized version, not the corporate spin. The actual truth about what I did wrong, why I did it, and what I've learned. And then I'm going to let them decide if I deserve to keep leading this company." "That's risky," Margaret said. "You could lose everything." "I could," Richard agreed. "But I've realized something over the past month. Emily asked me why I'm trying to do better, because I got caught, or because I understand what I did was wrong. And I realized that if I can't be honest with the board about my failures, then I haven't really learned anything. I'm just getting better at managing my image." Margaret sat down next to him. "I'm proud of you," she said quietly. "Don't be proud yet," Richard said. "I haven't actually done anything except start to fix problems I created in the first place." "That's more than a lot of people do," Margaret pointed out. "Most people just keep digging when they find themselves in a hole. You're actually trying to climb out."
Richard picked up his pen again. I have to try. Not just for the board, not just for the employees, for Emily. She needs to see that when you make a mistake, even a big one, you can take responsibility for it and do better. "She sees it," Margaret said. "She told me yesterday that she thinks you're trying really hard to be a better daddy and a better boss." Those were her exact words, a better daddy and a better boss. Richard felt tears prick at his eyes. That's all I want to be. Not the richest man, not the most admired CEO, just better than I was. Margaret kissed his forehead and left him to his letter. Richard wrote late into the night, choosing each word carefully, not to craft the perfect message, but to find the honest one. 2 days later, Richard Hale stood before the board of directors, the same people who'd watched his world implode when his daughter accidentally played that video. He'd prepared a presentation. He had data showing improved employee satisfaction, operational changes implemented, and positive feedback from staff surveys. Susan Park had helped him craft a narrative that would satisfy the board's concerns while protecting his position. But instead of starting with the presentation, Richard set it aside. "Before I show you the data," he said, "I need to say something. 30 days ago, this board gave me an ultimatum: prove that I could change or lose my position as CEO, and for the past month, I've been working hard to demonstrate that change. But I've realized that if I'm not honest with you about why I needed to change in the first place, then nothing I've done matters." He took a deep breath.
The video my daughter accidentally played wasn't an aberration. It was a reveal. It showed you exactly who I'd become. Someone so focused on maintaining a reputation for goodness that I'd stopped actually being good. I took money from employees who'd earned it and needed it, so I could fund a charitable project that would make me look generous. That wasn't a one-time mistake. It was the culmination of years of prioritizing image over integrity. The board members shifted in their seats,
This wasn't what they'd expected. My 10-year-old daughter saw what I'd done, and she understood something I'd forgotten. There's a difference between looking good and being good. And she had the courage, accidentally, but still, to force me to confront that difference. Richard pulled out the letter he'd written. I've spent the past month trying to become the person I should have been all along. I've listened to employees I should have been listening to for years. I've fixed problems I should never have allowed to exist. I've tried to lead with actual integrity instead of performing integrity. And the data shows that it's working. He activated the presentation, showing the improved survey results, the positive operational changes, the renewed employee trust. But here's what I want you to know, Richard continued. If you decide to remove me as CEO, I'll support that decision. Because the most important thing isn't whether I get to keep my job. It's whether Hale Global becomes the kind of company that actually lives up to the values we claim to embody. And if David Chen or someone else can do that better than I can, then that's what should happen.
He set down the remote. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm asking you to hold me accountable. If you keep me as CEO, it should be because you genuinely believe I've changed and can continue to change, not because I've done a good job of damage control. And if you remove me, I'll accept that too, because accountability is what I should have practiced all along. The room was silent. Finally, James Morrison spoke. Richard, you've given us a lot to consider. We'll need time to discuss this and make our decision. We'll reconvene in 2 hours. Richard nodded and left the room. He spent those 2 hours in his office, not preparing more arguments or rehearsing more speeches. He just sat quietly, thinking about Emily, about Margaret, about Mark Lewis and Sarah Chen and all the other employees whose names he'd finally learned. He thought about the man he'd been when he started Hale Global, young, ambitious, but genuinely wanting to make a difference. And he thought about the man he'd become, someone who'd lost sight of the difference entirely. His phone buzzed. A text from Emily. Good luck, Daddy. I believe in you. She was at school. She shouldn't even know the meeting was happening, but Margaret must have told her. Richard stared at those words, I believe in you, and felt something solidify inside him. Whatever the board decided, he would be okay. Because his daughter believed in him again. That was worth more than keeping his job. The 2 hours passed. Richard returned to the boardroom. The board members were already seated. Their faces were unreadable. James Morrison stood up. Richard, we've reached a decision. It wasn't unanimous, and it came with conditions. But after extensive discussion, the board has decided to keep you as CEO of Hale Global. Richard felt a wave of relief, but it was tempered by Morrison's mention of conditions.
However, Morrison continued, this decision comes with significant structural changes. First, we're establishing an employee advisory council that will have direct access to the board. No more decisions about employee compensation or benefits without employee input. Second, Carol Zhang added, you'll be required to continue the department rotation program indefinitely. 1 day a week, every week, working alongside employees at all levels of the organization. Third, another board member said, we're restructuring your compensation. Your salary will remain the same, but performance bonuses will now be tied not just to financial metrics, but to employee satisfaction scores and ethical compliance measures. And finally, Morrison concluded, you'll be working with a leadership coach, someone external to the company, who will provide regular assessments of your decision-making and leadership development. These assessments will be shared with the board quarterly. Richard absorbed all of this. They were putting him on a leash, essentially, restricting his autonomy, subjecting him to oversight, making him prove his change wasn't temporary. I accept all of those conditions, Richard said. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to continue leading this company. I won't waste it. Morrison nodded. See that you don't. This was a close decision, Richard. Not everyone was convinced. You'll need to prove every day that we made the right choice. After the meeting, Susan Park caught up with him in the hallway. Congratulations, she said. Though I'm not sure if congratulations is the right word for accepting a position with that many restrictions. It's exactly the right word,
Richard said, because those restrictions are exactly what I need. They'll keep me honest, they'll keep me accountable, they'll prevent me from sliding back into old patterns. Susan studied him. You've actually changed, haven't you? This isn't just performance.
I'm trying to change, Richard corrected. Every day I'm trying. Some days will be better than others, but I'm committed to the trying. Good, Susan said, because this company needs a leader who actually leads, not just someone who looks good in photographs. That evening, Richard came home to find Emily waiting for him at the door, practically bouncing with anticipation. "Did you keep your job?" she asked immediately. "I did," Richard said, scooping her up in a hug even though she was probably too old for it now. "I kept my job." "I knew you would," Emily said. "I told Sophia you would, because you've been working really hard to be better." "I have," Richard agreed, setting her down. "And I'm going to keep working hard. Every day." "Does that mean you'll still do the thing where you work with different people in your company?" Emily asked. "I think that's really cool. Like most bosses just sit in their offices, but you actually do the regular jobs." "Yes, I'll still do that. In fact, it's one of the rules now. I have to do it every week." "That's a good rule," Emily said firmly. Then, more hesitantly, "Daddy, can I ask you something?" "Always." "If I hadn't played that video by accident, would you have ever changed? Would you still have taken Mr. Lewis's money for the pictures?" It was the question Richard had been dreading, the one he'd been asking himself for the past month. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I want to say yes, that I would have eventually realized what I was doing wrong. But the truth is, I might not have. I was very good at justifying my decisions to myself. So maybe I needed you to accidentally show me the truth. Maybe that was the only way I could see it." Emily thought about this. "So I kind of helped you, even though it was an accident?" "You absolutely helped me, sweetheart. You helped me more than you'll probably ever understand." Emily smiled, then said, "Daddy, next time you go to work with different people, can I come visit? Not to a big meeting, just like to see what you do. But I promise I'll keep my tablet in my backpack and I won't record anything." Richard laughed, genuinely laughed for the first time in weeks. "Yes, you can come visit. But Emily, if you do happen to record something accidentally, I promise not to yell at you this time. Deal?" "Deal!" Emily hugged him again, then ran off to finish her homework. Margaret appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "She's been worried all day," she said, even though I told her it would be fine. "It wasn't guaranteed to be fine," Richard pointed out. "I know, but I had faith in you." Margaret walked over and kissed him. "I'm glad they kept you. But more importantly, I'm glad you're actually becoming the person you were pretending to be." "I'm trying," Richard said. "God knows I'm trying." "That's all anyone can ask for," Margaret said. "Well, that and consistent follow-through, and genuine change, and—" "I get it," Richard said, smiling. "The bar is high." "The bar is where it should have been all along," Margaret corrected. "But better late than never." 6 months later, Mark Lewis was promoted to Senior Compliance Officer. He got a significant raise and a real office instead of a cubicle. More importantly, he finally moved into that studio apartment near the river. When Richard Hale personally delivered the promotion news, Mark had been skeptical. "Is this because of the video?" he'd asked bluntly. "Because I was there and I saw what I saw?" "Partially," Richard admitted, "but mostly because your direct supervisor says you're the best compliance officer she's ever worked with. And you've been passed over for promotion 3 times because I kept insisting we didn't have the budget." "We had the budget, Mark. I was just allocating it wrong." Mark had accepted the promotion. He still kept the crumpled memo in his desk drawer, though, a reminder that trust was earned through consistent action, not grand gestures. But over time, he found himself taking it out less and less, because Richard Hale kept showing up. Every week, working alongside different departments. Every Friday, holding those open feedback sessions. Every month, implementing changes based on what he learned. It wasn't perfect. Richard still made mistakes, still occasionally slipped into old patterns of prioritizing optics. But the difference was that now there were systems in place to catch him, to push back, to hold him accountable. The Employee Advisory Council had real power. The leadership coach wasn't a rubber stamp, and the employees, slowly, cautiously, began to trust that the change might actually be real. Sarah Chen successfully completed her IVF treatments and gave birth to a healthy baby girl. She named her Emily,
after the little girl who'd accidentally exposed the truth that set everything in motion. When Richard heard about the name choice, he sent Sarah a personal note of congratulations and a generous gift for the baby. Not for publicity, the gesture was never mentioned in any company communications, but because it was the right thing to do. 1 year after the infamous board meeting, Emily Hale celebrated her 11th birthday. Her party wasn't at some expensive venue with hired entertainment. Instead, she asked if they could have it at the Newark Community Center that had started this whole mess. "I want to see the families who live there," she explained to her parents. "I want to know if it really helped them or if it was just for pictures." So they went to Newark, and Emily met the families, saw the children playing in the park her father's company had built, heard the genuine gratitude from parents who now had safe, affordable homes. It was real good, genuine impact, not just performance.
But on the drive home, Emily was quiet. "What are you thinking about?" Richard asked, glancing at her in the rearview mirror. "I'm thinking," Emily said slowly, "that maybe both things can be true at the same time. Like, the Newark Center really did help people. That's good. But you did it for wrong reasons at first, and that hurt other people. That's bad. So it's like complicated." "Yes," Richard agreed. "It's exactly that complicated. Most things in life are." "So how do you know if you're doing the right thing?" Emily asked. "You ask yourself why you're doing it," Margaret said, turning to look at her daughter. "And you make sure the why is good, not just the what. You make sure you're not hurting people in order to help other people. And if you make a mistake, you admit it and fix it." Emily nodded, absorbing this. "I think I get it. It's like, be actually nice, not pretend nice." This simple phrase from a teenager captures everything, doesn't it? If you're finding value in this exploration of ethics and transformation, consider supporting the channel by liking this video and checking out the other stories in our playlist about leadership and redemption. "Exactly," Richard said, smiling at his daughter's simple wisdom. "Be actually nice, not pretend nice." "Okay," Emily said. "I can do that." "I think you already do, sweetheart," Richard said, "better than most adults I know." 2 years after the incident, Richard Hale stood on a stage at a business ethics conference. He'd been invited to speak about corporate leadership and accountability. The old Richard Hale would have given a polished speech about the importance of values and integrity, with carefully selected anecdotes that made him look good. The new Richard Hale told the truth. He told them about the video his daughter had accidentally played, about the bonuses he'd delayed to fund a publicity opportunity, about the moment he realized he'd become someone who valued appearance over reality. He told them about Mark Lewis, whose name he hadn't known until his daughter pointed him out, about Sarah Chen and her IVF treatments, about all the employees he'd treated as line items instead of people. And he told them about the long, difficult process of actually changing. Not just performing change, but genuinely becoming a different kind of leader. "I'm not here to tell you I'm a better person now," Richard concluded. "I'm here to tell you that I'm trying to be a better person. Every day I have to choose between what looks good and what is good, and some days I still choose wrong. But I have people around me now who will call me on it, who will hold me accountable, who will remind me that leadership isn't about managing perception. It's about serving the people who trust you to lead them." He paused, then added, "And if you want to know who taught me that lesson, it was my 10-year-old daughter, with an accidentally recorded video and the most brutally honest question I've ever been asked. So you could have helped them without taking money from people like Mr. Lewis, right?" The answer was yes, and once I admitted that to myself, everything else followed. The audience was silent for a moment, then someone started clapping. Others joined in. It wasn't the thunderous applause Richard used to receive for his polished speeches. It was quieter, more thoughtful. It was the sound of people recognizing an uncomfortable truth. After the speech, several other CEOs approached him. Some thanked him for his honesty. Others admitted they'd made similar compromises and hadn't been caught yet. One older executive pulled Richard aside. "You're brave to tell that story publicly. Most people would have buried it, managed the PR, moved on." "I tried that," Richard said. "It didn't work. The truth has a way of surfacing, whether you want it to or not. Better to own it than to keep running from it." "What if people use this against you? Your competitors, your critics?"
"Then they use it against me," Richard shrugged. "I can't control what other people do with my story. I can only control whether I'm honest about it. 5 years after the incident, Emily Hale was 15 years old and applying to high schools. One of her application essays asked her to write about a person who'd influenced her life. She wrote about her father. Not the CEO who gave generously to charity, not the businessman featured in magazines. She wrote about the man who'd made a terrible mistake, been exposed by his own daughter's accident, and then actually changed. My father taught me that being good isn't about looking good, she wrote. It's about making hard choices every day, even when no one's watching. It's about admitting when you're wrong, even when it costs you something. And it's about understanding that the people affected by your decisions aren't just numbers or abstractions. They're real people with real lives that matter just as much as yours does. She continued, I used to think adults had everything figured out, that they knew all the right answers. But when I was 10 years old, I accidentally showed a video at my dad's work meeting that revealed he'd made a really bad decision. At first, I thought I'd ruined everything. I thought it was my fault. But later, I realized that sometimes the best thing you can do for someone you love is show them the truth, even if it's uncomfortable, even if it's accidental. Because the truth gives people the chance to change. And change, real change, is always better than a comfortable lie. When Richard read the essay, Emily had asked him to proofread it. He had to stop halfway through because his vision was blurring with tears. It's perfect, he managed to say. Don't change a word. You don't think it makes you sound bad? Emily asked, worried.
It makes me sound human, Richard said, which is exactly what I am, a human who made mistakes and is trying to do better. That's the truth, Emily, and I'm grateful that you're willing to tell it. Emily hugged him. She was almost as tall as Margaret now, nearly grown. But in that moment, Richard could still see the 10-year-old girl with the tablet, the child who'd accidentally saved him from himself. Thank you, he whispered into her hair. For what? For showing me the truth, for believing I could change, for being actually nice, not pretend nice. Emily laughed. We should put that on a plaque in your office. Be actually nice, not pretend nice. You know what? Richard said. That's not a bad idea. 10 years after the incident, Richard Hale retired from Hale Global. He was 62 years old and ready to step back. David Chen became the new CEO, bringing with him a leadership style that balanced operational excellence with genuine employee care. The company continued to thrive, but now with systems and culture that prevented the kind of ethical compromises that had once seemed routine. On Richard's last day, the employees threw him a party. Not a formal corporate event, but a real celebration organized by the staff. Mark Lewis, now Vice President of Compliance, gave a speech. I first encountered Richard Hale 10 years ago, in the worst way possible, Mark began. I was sitting in a board meeting, watching my promised bonus disappear so he could fund a PR opportunity. I saw the real man behind the benevolent facade, and I was angry, I was hurt, and I seriously considered leaving the company. He paused, letting that sink in. But then, something remarkable happened. Richard didn't just apologize and move on. He actually changed. He showed up. Day after day, week after week, year after year, he showed up. He learned our names, he understood our work. He fixed systemic problems. And he built a company culture where what happened to me could never happen again. Mark looked directly at Richard. You're not perfect. You still make mistakes. But you taught all of us something important, that leadership isn't about being perfect. It's about being accountable. It's about caring more about doing right than looking right. And that's a legacy worth celebrating. The room erupted in genuine applause. 10 years of consistent change. That's the real story here. If you've stayed with us this far, you're clearly someone who values depth and character development. Subscribe for more long-form narratives that explore the complexity of human nature and corporate culture. Not the polite corporate clapping of Richard's old speeches, but real appreciation from people who'd watched him transform. Richard stood up to say a few words. He looked around the room at faces he now knew, really knew,
and felt a profound sense of gratitude. "Thank you all," he began. "I don't deserve the kind words Mark just shared. Or rather, I didn't deserve them 10 years ago. But I've spent the past decade trying to earn them. And if I've succeeded at all, it's because you all held me accountable. You didn't let me slide back into old patterns. You pushed me to be better. You gave me honest feedback, even when it was uncomfortable. You made me into the leader I should have been from the beginning." He smiled. "I'm often asked what the turning point was for me, what made me change. And the answer is always the same. It was a video my daughter accidentally played during a board meeting, a 45-second clip that showed everyone exactly who I'd become. It was humiliating, it was painful, and it was absolutely necessary."
My daughter Emily asked me once if I would have changed if she hadn't played that video, and I told her the truth. Probably not. I was too good at justifying my choices to myself. I needed to be exposed. I needed to have the uncomfortable truth shoved in my face by a 10-year-old with a tablet. The room laughed, but it was warm laughter, not mocking. So here's my advice to all of you, especially those of you in leadership positions. Find your Emily. Find the people who will tell you the truth, even when it's uncomfortable, especially when it's uncomfortable. Build systems that hold you accountable. And when you inevitably make mistakes, because you will, own them, fix them, and do better. Richard looked around one last time. This company isn't my legacy. You are. The culture you've built, the values you practice, the care you show each other, that's the legacy. And I'm grateful I got to be a part of it, even if I had to be dragged here kicking and screaming by an accidental video recording. After the party, as Richard was packing up his personal items, he found something wedged in the back of his desk drawer. It was the tablet, Emily's old tablet, the one that had recorded that fateful video. He powered it on. It still worked, amazingly. And there, in the video folder, was the file. daddy_office_recording_3.mp4. Richard hesitated, then pressed play. He watched himself from 10 years ago, pointing at that spreadsheet, casually delaying employee bonuses for a publicity opportunity. He heard his own voice, impatient and cold, so different from the man he'd become. And he understood why Emily had been so confused and frightened. The man in that video was a stranger, someone who'd lost sight of what mattered. Richard deleted the video, not to hide the evidence. That truth was already out, already processed, already learned from. But because he didn't need to watch it anymore. He knew who that man was, and he knew who he'd become instead. Emily Hale graduated from college with honors. She majored in nonprofit management and ethics, surprising exactly no one who knew her story. At her graduation party, Richard pulled her aside. "I'm proud of you," he said. "Not just for graduating, but for the person you've become. You have integrity, Emily. Real integrity, not the performed kind." "I learned from the best," Emily said, then grinned. "Eventually, after you stopped being the worst." Richard laughed. "That's fair." "Seriously though, Dad," Emily said, her tone softening. "Thank you for showing me that people can change. That's an important lesson. A lot of my friends have complicated relationships with their parents, and they don't think people can really change. But I know they can, because I watched you do it." "It wasn't easy," Richard admitted. "Nothing worthwhile is," Emily said. "You taught me that too." She hugged him, and Richard held his daughter, marveling at the woman she'd become. Strong, principled, compassionate. Everything he'd spent 10 years trying to become himself. "I love you, Dad," Emily said. "I love you too, sweetheart. Thank you for accidentally saving me." "Anytime," Emily laughed. "Though maybe next time I'll do it on purpose."